Welcome, and thank you for taking the time to review this learning module. The ABCs of Supporting Your Child's Social Emotional Needs at Home is part of a series provided by the Student Support Services Department at Sparta Township Public Schools to support the needs of students and their families during the school closure due to the COVID-19 crisis. Our team has also developed student learning modules to support the identified needs of our students. So I'm your presenter, Dr. Saskia Brown. I have over 20 plus years of professional experience working with children in both educational and clinical settings. I've previously served children and their families as a mental health clinician, a special education teacher, school administrator, and project manager for the New Jersey Tiered Systems of Support at the New Jersey Department of Education. I currently serve as the supervisor of pupil personnel services in Sparta, where I oversee the Student Support Service Department for grades K through 8. I'm also an adjunct professor at Drew University in the Teacher Education Program and own my own educational consulting company. I think what really makes me qualified to provide you with some help is the fact that I am a mother of a 16-year-old human who I've been stuck in the house with for the last 5 weeks, and we are both still alive. So you can feel assured that I've tested these strategies out on him, and he turned out pretty fine so far. So parents often know their child better than anyone else, but today I want to share with you some general ways for you to consider supporting the social and emotional needs of your child during these stressful times at home. So maybe you'll learn something new or reinforce the strategies that you're already using. These strategies can be used with children in elementary and middle schools, regardless of their abilities. However, this presentation is not really designed to meet the individual needs of your child, but rather provide you with some best practices that works for most children. There are children that require more intensive methods to support their needs. So before we get started, it is important to also note that this presentation does not provide a crisis response protocol. If at any time you believe that your child is in danger of hurting themselves or others, please be sure to call 911 emergency. At the end of this presentation, you'll also find some additional information for crisis situations, like numbers to hotlines that will also be helpful. So when we talk about addressing the social emotional needs of children, we can often identify those needs based on their behaviors. So in education, we often conduct functional behavior assessments to help identify the causes of behavior, to isolate the way we respond, and the types of supports to provide. So this presentation will give you a parent view of that ABC process, share some of the best practices and strategies to support the social emotional needs, and provide you with access to resources and tools that might be helpful in supporting your child. So behavior is defined as the way that one acts. So a behavior becomes a problem when it interferes with learning for self or others, or causes disruption in the home environment, or maybe even harmful to the child or others. So behaviors can be grouped based on how they're expressed. So often we pay attention to the externalizing behaviors. Those are the ones that we see, like temper tantrums. But it's also important to be aware of the internalizing behaviors, things like depression and sadness. The function of a behavior is to usually access or obtain something like attention or sensory stimulation, or to escape or avoid something like an undesired activity. So we're going to start with the A in this ABC process, which stands for antecedent. This is what usually occurs prior to the behavior that we see. It's really the most critical part of the process, because if we focused on the antecedent, then we can prevent or even reduce the occurrences of behavior problems. So it's important that we set clear expectations for ourselves as parents and for our children. So preparation and respectful communication are two key areas of prevention. So let's review some of the ways that you can prepare and communicate respectfully with your child. When thinking about preparation, we think about the physical environment and personal space. So it's really important that the physical environment that a child is in is conducive to whatever activity they are working on. Many of you may have multiple children. It's also important that even in that setting, that each child has their own personal space. So that can be at a table where one section of the table belongs to you and another section belongs to another child. So it's important that everyone has a space in which they feel safe and they can work in. The other important thing about preparation is having daily schedules and routines in place. That will really help to go through the day by having a structure of how the day is organized, how the week is organized. And I'm going to share a little bit as we move on, a particular strategy and some tools to support this scheduling piece. But scheduling routine is really helpful because it tells the child what to expect next. And it doesn't feel chaotic that the day is kind of moving along without structure. The other thing that you can use in terms of preparation are sequencing charts or checklists. So those are like visual cues that help a child to know what they should do now and what they should do next. Or a checklist where once they have completed an activity, they can check it off. It could be on a dry erase board. They can mark it off so that they feel successful as they're accomplishing those tasks. That's also really helpful if you're given instructions to a child to do something, that if you quickly write those steps on a dry erase board, once they do each step, they can mark it off and go on to the next step. This way, they're sure of what's coming next or what happened before. The other piece of preparation is this idea of self-check and reflection, really providing an opportunity to, one, assess how our child is doing, their emotions, how they feel. So when we get up in the morning, they can give us a thumbs up, thumbs down about how they feel. We can use emotions chart for them to identify their feelings. And I'll share an example of that later on in the presentation. But that's really helpful to be able to kind of see how the day is going to begin. Often, if we can assess how a child feels before we start to do anything, we can figure out how to support them during this time, right? Because if our child is happy versus being sad, we are going to take a different approach. The other piece is reflection and providing opportunities, whether that's through journaling or even being able to articulate and express how they feel, is a really great way of kind of setting the tone. And then lastly is relationships, right? The importance of relationships is critical here, because our relationships is really what helps us in how we communicate with our child and how they respond to us. So it's important that we have those positive and strong relationships when we're looking to support their social and emotional needs. So when we think about communication, I put respectful communication because as a parent myself, sometimes I have to remember the respectful piece of communication because I tend to be the authority in our household. So I always want to remember ways to make sure that when I'm communicating with my son, I'm doing so in a respectful way. So the first is using I messages. I think these messages are really powerful. It removes our bias from our statements. It doesn't personalize what we're saying to kids. So for example, if you were asking your child to do something, you can say, I would like it if you did this. I would like it if you washed the dishes, for example. Those I messages really help you to be very specific too about how you are communicating your expectations. The other piece is this idea of direct and specific instruction. Some of the times I am very much guilty of this. I will like shout out 30 things that I need my son to do in one time. It's really important that we stop, Provide very direct and specific instruction, and then offer opportunities for our child to give us feedback. So, did you understand the instructions that I gave you? Sometimes clarifying that before they do something is helpful, because you don't have to clarify it after it's already done wrong. So you want to make sure that you're giving those instructions, and that the younger the kids are, is the less that we give them at one time, right? So we may want to give them one thing to do and then come back and do something else, or use visual reminders or prompts to help them to make sure that they get through all of them. The other piece about respectful communication is tone and body language. Tone is really important in two ways in body language. The first is that it is really important that when we are communicating with our children, that we're using a tone that is assertive, but that is not threatening, right? So that we're not like raising our voice and screaming, but we're articulating and communicating our thoughts effectively. And our body language says we mean business, right? So if I'm asking you to do something, that my body language should also say to you that I am very serious at this time in what I need you to do. The other thing about body language is that when communicating, you want to make sure that your body language is open, so that you're not like crossing your arms when talking to them, or even I try my best to not, when I'm communicating with my son, I try to be at his eye level. Well, at this point, he's much taller than me, but when he was younger, I would get down to his level to be able to speak to him. I wouldn't have him sit down and stand over him to give him any of those specific instructions. So it's important that you're kind of checking your tone and your body language when you're communicating. The other piece is this idea of verbal and nonverbal cues. It's what, I used to laugh when I was younger that my mother would look at me and I would know what that meant. Well, those verbal and nonverbal cues are really helpful, right? So the verbal cues are those little prompts that you may give, reminding them to do something, but some of those nonverbal cues can be gestures. So for example, if we have like a hand gesture that shows whether you're okay right now. Let's just say I am working from home and I'm sitting in the kitchen, you may be in the living room, you need help, but I am on a call. You may say to them, just put a thumbs up, give me a thumbs up if you're good, thumbs down if you're not. This way you can communicate without using language. So it's important to kind of have some of those nonverbal cues, because you can help to kind of monitor your child's behavior while you might be engaged in doing other things. And then the last piece about respectful communication is this idea of open-ended questions. Don't ask questions that only, if you want to have a conversation, don't ask questions that require yes or no, right? So we want to ask questions that say, could you not, how was your day today, right? Because then I can say good, okay. Or we want to change that to say something like, describe your day to me. Tell me the things that made your day successful. So it provides us, open-ended questions allow more discussion in terms of communication. So I want to just talk a little bit, I shared before this idea of visual schedules, and I want to give you a real practical strategy for visual schedules. So you can use schedules. They can be hourly, they can be daily, they can be weekly. You can have a printed version. You can have an electronic version on a phone, an app, a device. You can have an adaptive version, like a dry erase board, something that's on a child's wall that you can manipulate. So this, you'll see right here, there's a daily schedule, like just to give you an idea of how you could possibly structure your day. So you'll see in this example of the schedule, it is not by time, but rather by like routines based on morning, afternoon, and evening. So you may want to start with some type of morning routine to get the kids up, get them ready, Then you may want to have some type of choice activity, something they may like to do, something that requires some creativity. There may be some opportunity there to have lunch, then be able to kind of go outside and do something physical. Then you may want them to come back, get some of their work done, do some reading and chores. Then have some set time for screen time. Right now, I know that, most of our learning is online, and I don't know about the kids, but I am overwhelmed by the amount of time that I'm spending on the device. So I always say, try to limit the amount of screen time as much as possible, and really have kids engage in other types of activities like board games and other things that don't require use of their device or the internet. And then you may want to structure some time that says, we'll have dinner around this time. There'll be some more opportunities for us to play or engage as a family, and then some bedtime routines to have a normal routine and be consistent around bedtime. So that's just a very basic example of how you can structure your day. It's important, though, that structure is necessary, but that we are not so structured that we're rigid, right? Because there are things that occur and come up that may require us to shift, for example, our free choice activity to the morning and the afternoon based on our schedules. The value, though, of having a schedule is, for example, when it is time for all of us in this house to work, then if you are working from home, everybody is working at that time. So you're not trying to work while your kids are like playing and making noise, because when it is that structured work time, I am working in my preferred space. My child is working in their preferred space. We're using our nonverbal cues to communicate. And this way it would allow you an opportunity to kind of get some work done with less interruptions, if you will. So I provided 2 resources there for you. One is a resource on printable schedules for kids. There are just tons of them where you can just literally click and print and be able to utilize. And then also an article around some of the calendar apps for things on the iPhone. And I know the kids love the iPhone, so that is something that there's some apps up there that are really good at organizing schedules and providing reminders. So there can be like prompts for a kid to remind them that it's time for them to transition to the next activity. So that's just some ideas about utilizing a schedule. The other thing we talked about was that reflective practice as a strategy. And this can be by you can have charts like the one that you see here. That's a very basic, how am I feeling today, that has some expression of the emotions. You can use words and images. It can be a scale. So for example, you can have a scale that at the bottom says, I'm cold, I'm on green, everything is good, or, I'm feeling upset, I'm on yellow, and oh my God, I can't control myself, I'm on red. I must tell you that I have a bias to those types of charts if they are public. I don't mind using them privately with kids, but when it comes to having kids reflect, it's important that they're the ones that are seeing this, that you allow them to gauge how they're feeling, and that it's not used as a tool to embarrass them in front of other people or their siblings, for example, about where they are in their feelings. So you can utilize charts, you can utilize scales. The other thing you can utilize are journals. So there are journals that have written prompts, for example, very elaborate prompts for some of our older kids who want to express themselves, and then things like sentence starters for our younger kids. I feel ... and they can kind of fill that out. So that you can find those in printed versions or even online versions. And I did provide you with some resources here on printable emotions faces, also applications around mindfulness for controlling emotions, and then printed journals and templates, which are all free. So, applying the strategy of reflective practice and utilizing an emotions chart with your child is really helpful, because then you can, one, assess how they're feeling, and two, allow them to be able to self-reflect. So the other strategy we talked about before was this idea of iMessages. So I wanted to just kind of provide you with some examples of what an iMessage may sound like, different options for in response to an unwanted behavior. So for example, if a child is throwing a toy, instead of saying stop throwing the toy, which automatically starts with a negative, right? Stop, or a directive, you can say to them, I need you to keep your toys on the floor. Or, it scares me when you're throwing your toys because I'm afraid that you may hurt someone. Those iMessages are extremely powerful, and it allows us to focus on the action and not our emotion or response to the action. So for example, a child who's not cleaning up in preparation for lunch, instead of saying, Johnny, I need you to clean up right now because we need to get to lunch, you can say, I would like it if you put away your toys now. Or you can share with the child how their action is causing you to feel some way. So you can say, I feel angry that you're still playing with your toys because we are all waiting on you for us to be able to have lunch. So these are just some basic examples of kind of conditioning ourselves to not initially respond based on our emotion and provide kids with our directives, but rather utilizing those iMessages to be able to articulate to them what they're doing and how it's making you feel as their parent. So I hope that, you can kind of look at some of the other examples here, but there are also tons of resources online that have like starters, like iMessage starters, but it's a really great practical strategy to help to redirect a kid that allows you to kind of maintain your control and provide that direct, explicit instruction to them. So now we get into B, the B in the ABC, and B is for the behavior. So this is actually what the child is doing. And it's one of the things that I think people focus too much on, is how do we respond to their actions in the moment? So remember I said before, the A is really critical, because the key is that if we can create conditions that reduce these behaviors, then we won't have to focus so much on actually the behaviors themselves. So when we think about some of the practical strategies, what do you do when a child is acting out, when the behavior is being exhibited? One of the things that is a good quick strategy, besides ignoring, right? Because there are some behaviors that, remember, if a child is looking to seek attention, like we talked about the function of the behavior earlier, if a child is looking to do so, giving them an attention to behaviors that may not necessarily warrant that could be reinforcing a negative behavior, right? So there are times where the strategy of ignoring a behavior is necessary. It's what I call, as parents, picking and choosing our battles. So when we do find a battle that we want to fight, we can utilize quick strategies to be able to do so. And I think timeout is one of the things that is really effective, and it can be done immediately. It doesn't require any elaborate type of training, but it requires the immediate removal of the child from whatever the desired activity is. And I've created what I call the stop method, just to remind us of the steps or the pieces of timeout that need to be in place. And the first is space, right? If we are going to immediately remove a child from a desired activity, we should already have an identified location that's clear of distraction, so the child knows it and we know it. So everybody knows where that space is. The other piece is that it should be timed. You know, we don't put kids in timeout and just kind of leave them there forever. So we want to do that in short periods, and we want to be timed, whether we're using a phone or a timer, to be able to say, okay, this is the opportunity that we're giving you to kind of get yourself focused, refocused, and then we can do that when this time is up. The other thing is open communication, making sure that when we are putting the child into timeout, that we're very clear and concise. This is not an opportunity for debate and discourse, right? The directions are really specific, and we're using things like those I messages. I need you to get up, and you are going to go to wherever that timeout space is. So this is where we're not allowing a lot of back and forth with the child. We're providing them with clear, concise communication, and then we're moving on to the P. And I think some of the times we forget this piece, and it's really, really critical. And it's that positive praise. And I know it sounds contradictory, right? Because we're thinking you're going into timeout because you're not doing what I've asked you to do. Positive praise is really effective in helping a child transition into timeout and transition out of timeout. So we're using words to, one, acknowledge, wow, thank you for getting up so quickly and moving to your designated space. Or while a child is in timeout, right, they may get there and they're still kind of kicking, but the moment that they're sitting still with their arms and legs on the floor, for example, we're encouraging that. So we're saying to them, wow, I really like how you're sitting right now. It seems that you are really ready to do your time or reflect on your actions so that you can be, you can get up and move back into your activity. So it's really important that, we kind of use this stop method and we think about it the moment we think about putting a child in timeout, that we have an identified space, that we know the time and we're acknowledging that time, that we're providing them with clear, open communication, and then we're providing positive praise to be able to get them to timeout and to be able to transition them from timeout. So when timeout is over, you can have that conversation with the child about what happened and what your expectations are for them to be back into the desired activity. So hopefully using a method like timeout really helps us to not get to this step. But, I figured I would just quickly talk about power struggles, because they're probably the most popular in terms of dealing with behavior of your child. And the power struggle is really a conflict between a parent and the child, because someone is attempting to gain control, whether it's the parent who's attempting to gain that control or even the child. So I have this 4-step response for you to consider when that power struggle is occurring, what you need to do. And the first is disengaging emotions. It is probably the hardest piece, because we are human beings as parents, and the things that may occur that our child might have done or is doing may be hurtful to us. So we initially want to respond with our emotions. So it's really important that you take that deep breath, deal with that child when you are emotionally ready, right? So that you are not out of control when you are trying to provide them with that support. The other piece is, and I know that this sometimes can be hard because we think that because we're the parent, they should be listening to us. But it is important when this power struggle is occurring that you provide opportunities to listen to them and acknowledge that. So I hear what you're saying, and I understand that you're upset right now. So those words of validation by listening and acknowledging really helps to try to remove some of that emotional component to the power struggle. The other step is de-escalating the situation. The first thing I say is removing the audience. So if you are in the living room and other kids are there, or there are other people present, you can say to the child, is it okay if we talk in your bedroom, for example? It's important to remove the audience because kids tend to play to the audience. So if there's a lot of people around, and the reason that they're behaving this way is to seek attention, for example, then the more people, the better. And it's much harder to be able to de-escalate. The other thing is using that non-confrontational body language, right? So that we're not intimidating and trying to use our stature or how strong we are or how tall we are as parents to be able to get them to do something. So remember that body language that we talked about. And then here again, we're using those I messages. I need you to. I would like it if. We're speaking really softly. We do not, in the middle of a power struggle, the more your volume goes up or the more you're yelling is actually the less that anyone is hearing. So the more that you're speaking concisely and softly is important. The other thing is that in the power struggle, particularly with younger children, it's important to use their name, because some of the times if they're in the middle of a tantrum, using their name kind of redirects them, right? So you can say, Sarah, I need you to, and then that will help with that redirection process. The third step in this power struggle response is what I call admit the power. Sometimes this is so hard for us to do as parents. Admit and defer the power that the child has. Not that the child is in control. That is not the same thing. But admit that we can't make a child do anything they don't want to do unless we are forcing them to do that. The disadvantage of forcing them is that we are not teaching them how to regulate their own behavior. So admitting the power says, I understand, right, that my child is doing something that I don't want them to do. They don't have to do what I'm telling them to do, but I am giving them, right, the skills that they need to be able to regulate their own behavior so that when I am not there, they are able to control themselves. So admit the power. And then the last step is reviewing the alternatives. Calmly and slowly review the alternatives. And one of those alternatives that I love to use is choice. Often it's this idea of picking two things that I want you to do anyway. So I will issue choice, and then I'll be able to just walk away so that I am not engaging in this power struggle with you. And I'll talk a little bit about choice as we go along and how choice can be a strategy that's used. And I made just a notation here that, this 4-step response to the power struggle is if there's no immediate danger. So the child is not harming themselves or others. This is what we would be using as a strategy to support disengaging our emotions, de-escalating the situation, admitting where we are, and providing those alternatives. So now we're on to the C in ABC, which really stands for consequence. And which is how we respond to a child's behavior or what happens after the child's behavior, right? And it's helpful to know that we can reinforce that with positive behaviors. We can reinforce positive behaviors with consequences, and we can reduce negative ones with consequences. So I wanted to just review some general best practices to remember when dealing with your child's behaviors and this idea of consequence, right? The first is never forget that a child needs to maintain their dignity. And that's really important, especially if you have other children and you are trying to correct their behavior in front of their siblings. Make sure that you are speaking to them in a way that still allows them to maintain their dignity. And the older the child gets, is the more difficult this piece is for us as parents, because then they really start to come into their own in terms of their identity. And if you're not maintaining that dignity with them, it can really start to create barriers in your relationship. The other practice that I encourage you to not use is bargaining. Bargaining is not an option. Like, oh, if you do this, then I'll do this for you. It's really important that if you have clear expectations, that this is what I expect you to do. So we're not bargaining. I'm not, oh, I'll do this if you do that, right? Because there's an expectation that you are doing this. The other thing is to criticize the action and not the child. One of my biggest pet peeves is to hear people put adjectives in front of kids in how we describe who they are. It's important that, especially in situations where we are frustrated with what's happening, that we're not criticizing our child. We are criticizing the action. Next, developing a support system. When my son was younger, I had a support system in terms of when I was frustrated, I would tag myself out and tag his father in. Because some of the times you need to step away from the situation, and it's okay for you to do that. So have a support system. That can be a friend that you call to help you to kind of get yourself back together. That can be a place that you go to kind of gather your thoughts and get yourself back together. And then, in situations where you have kids who may have more intensive needs, have a plan. Have a plan in place, particularly for a crisis situation, that this is what we follow when this happens. Kind of having that plan in advance is helpful. Next is that making sure that when a behavior occurs, that you issue a timely and meaningful consequence. So yes, provide yourself an opportunity to stop and gather yourself and disengage those emotions, but make sure that's also timely, right? Don't try to issue a consequence for something that happened 2 days ago. Make sure that that's something that's timely. The next one is this idea that you judge your child for what they're doing and not for what they've done. And I am the first person to admit that when something happens, I want to defer to, and this is what you did the last time. It's really important that if we're trying to help our children to regulate their own behaviors, that we're not constantly reminding them of the failures that they may have had in the past, right? That we use those opportunities to teach for success, and that we're not constantly going back to, and this is what you did the last time. The other piece is telling your child that you understand their feelings and emotions. I didn't say you have to agree with their feelings and their emotions, but validation is critical. Validation says to someone else, I hear what you are saying, right? I understand how you feel. Doesn't mean I agree with it, but I understand it. I always say never use sarcasm or humiliation. Especially with younger kids, they don't even understand sarcasm. So I have no tolerance at all for sarcasm or publicly displaying or humiliating kids. I don't think it helps us. It doesn't help them. So I always say stay away from it. The other is reward for accomplishment, not promise, right? So I'm not promising you anything. There are some things in my household that you do and they're expected for you to do. But there are times where I will reward you for something that you have accomplished, but I'm not promising to buy you this or do this. I'm rewarding you. And it's important that they know the difference between a promise and a reward. Again, never intervene when you're out of control, right? Take a step, move away, take a deep breath, do whatever it is that you need to do to be able to get yourself into control. And then using choice when correcting, making sure that you are providing the child with these are your alternatives right now. And I always say quiet corrections are really powerful, right? There's an opportunity when something is occurring for you to kind of quietly go and say, I noticed that you're upset right now, and I would like to give you two choices. You can either do this or this, and allow them to make that choice. So those quiet corrections are really powerful, as opposed to kind of yelling and screaming. My other is, it's okay to admit when we're wrong. I know it sounds crazy as parents because we don't think we're wrong. And I mean, some of the times I don't think I'm wrong at all. But there are times where we're wrong, or our response to something may not have been the best, right? So it's okay to say that. Yesterday, I know my response to whatever, that I was really angry when speaking with you, and I'm sorry about how I communicated with you. That wasn't respectful. And then I always say my last and favorite is, like, make the death penalty the last option, meaning don't, make sure that the punishment really fits the crime, right? And this is the reason why we try not to do that out of our anger and our emotions, because then we will, like, shout out something that's really not realistic. Number one, like, you can never go back on your computer for the rest of the year. And even if it is realistic that you would take away that, is it really practical, and did it really warrant that? So it's important that you're kind of, and your child the best, that you are balancing what's realistic with what actually occurred, and not kind of putting the death penalty on the table as the option, when there are other things that we can do to kind of gradually reinforce what we're looking for. So, just some of those practices to consider, in terms of how we interact with our child in order to really support their social and emotional needs. So another practical strategy, this idea of reinforcement and consequences. If you notice, I didn't necessarily use the word punishment, but you will see that reinforcement is we use with a child to increase the behaviors that we want, and then to reduce the negative ones. So you'll see on this chart here the idea of that if we use positive reinforcement, that's something that really adds to encourage a behavior. And a negative reinforcement is something that is used to remove encouraged behavior. And the same thing with punishment, negative and positive. If we're using a negative punishment, it's something is removed to discourage the behavior, and a positive punishment, which we don't really think about, right? But that is something that's added to discourage a behavior. So again, in issuing those consequences, right, making sure that they're immediate, that they're consistent, and by God, whatever you say you're gonna do, make sure you do it. That's the reason why we don't put the death penalty on the table, because can we really follow through? Follow through is important, because if you say to your child that you're gonna do something and you don't do it, if that becomes your habit, they already know, oh, mom said she's gonna do it, she's really not gonna do it. So it's important that you're consistent, making sure that those are frequent, right? They're meaningful, and that they're balanced, right? That we're looking at what actually occurred versus what we're providing as a consequence. So I wanted to talk a little bit, as I said before, about the practical strategy of giving choice, right? So in the middle of de-escalating, for example, you may want to use your I statement, I need you to. I always say choice. I always give choice, that there are two things that I don't really mind if you do either one of them, but there are two things that I want you to do, right? Don't give the child an option about what do you want to do right now, because if the child says, I don't want to stop, then what are you going to do? Right? You shouldn't have even asked that question. So it's better to say, okay, here are your two choices, two things of which you don't mind if they do, so that you can get what you need done, but also they feel like they are controlling the situation, their behavior, they're making the decision, and you're not engaging in the power struggle. So let's quickly just take a look at a video demonstration of given choice.
Welcome to Helping Your Child Learn to Communicate. I'm Heather Hayward, a speech-language pathologist. In this video, we'll talk about the strategy of giving your child choices. When you give your child choices, it means that you present them with two options when asking them a question. This serves two purposes. It takes some of the pressure off of your child to formulate an acceptable answer, while at the same time still requiring that they respond. Here is an example of giving your child choices. It's time for a snack. Would you like a banana or an apple? Banana! Great, here you go. It's important to only provide choices when your child actually has a choice. Don't say, would you like to pick up your toys? This question implies that your child could say no to picking up toys. Instead, you could try, would you like to pick up your cars or blocks first? Giving your child choices gives them a feeling of control. It takes the pressure off your child to come up with an answer, but still requires that they provide a response. You can support your child's communication even more by providing visual options for them to choose from, like in the snack scenario, when the mom showed him an apple and a banana. I hope this video has helped you better understand the strategy of giving your child choices. When you give your child choices, you are helping them become a more successful communicator.
So now what? So now it's time to apply what you've learned, and let's talk about the next steps. So the first thing is pick one strategy that I shared today and try it out. There's no need to try every single strategy. Maybe you just want to pick one, or maybe there's one strategy like choice or the use of I messages that you're already using, but you're not doing it consistently. So pick a strategy, try it out. Be consistent. Practice really does make perfect. The more you do it, the better you become at it. And don't really give up. This idea that there's a quick fix out there doesn't exist. There is no quick fix when we talk about how we help our children to regulate their behavior, to support their social and emotional needs. So there is no quick fix. It does require us to work. So be consistent. Pick a strategy, be consistent, practice it. But then lastly, know your limits. You're not a failure if you tried something consistently and it's not working. It's okay to ask for help. There are professionals that are there that can help you to really work with your child. So please use the links that are provided here to access these additional resources to support the social emotional needs of your child. A handout of this presentation has also been provided in both English and Spanish for your reference so that you're able to access those tools. So thank you so much for taking this time to watch this learning module. I really hope that you found at least one thing helpful today that you'll be able to use. If you do have any specific questions, or maybe you're thinking about more individualized support for your child, please feel free to contact me. I have my email there. You can use my Google phone number. Follow me on Twitter. Wish you all the best, and you can do this. Don't give up.